The millionaire pushed the door open and froze in shock when he saw his 7-year-old daughter kneeling in a puddle of water, her dress torn to shreds, her hands streaked with blood. That moment tore apart the facade of the luxurious house, exposing a horrifying truth of heartless threats and a ruthless scheme to seize the family's fortune, coming from within their very own bloodline. Who had turned this home into a living hell, imprisoning an innocent child? If you love heartwarming stories, touching tales about family, justice, and healing, this story will reach the deepest place in your heart. Follow the journey of a child stepping out of the shadows and a father learning how to be a father again, to see that good people deserve to be rewarded and the wicked are bound to pay the price. The sound of a wet rag scrubbing hard against the tiled floor echoed through the vast mansion, the dripping of water mixed with the labored breathing of a child. Emily, 7 years old, knelt on the floor, her old pink and blue dress worn thin and stained, soaked with patches of water. Her tiny hands were red and raw, the fingertips bleeding, yet she still clutched the faded rag tightly. Above her stood Margaret, arms folded. She was 28, tall, with short wavy black hair, a string of pearls around her neck that once belonged to Sarah, Emily's late mother, who had died not long ago of leukemia. The tight red dress hugged her figure, catching the soft light that filtered in through the window. But the voice that came out was cold, sharp as a blade. "Get down and scrub it clean. And that puddle over there too. Don't make me repeat myself, useless child." Emily gasped for air, her shoulders trembling. In a faint voice she whispered, "Please, let me rest for just a moment. My hands hurt so much. I can't keep scrubbing." Margaret leaned forward, lifted the remaining bucket of water, and flung it across the floor. The splash soaked into the little girl's knees where she knelt. "If you're tired, that means you need to scrub harder. And if you dare whisper a word of this to your father, I will throw your mother's ashes out of this house." Emily bit down on her lip. Her eyes turned red, tears brimming but never falling into a cry. Her mother's name pierced her like a knife, forcing her to bow her head and drag the rag across the wet floor again. Suddenly, the front wooden door swung open. The sharp sound of Italian leather shoes striking the floor rang out. Daniel Mitchell, the master of the mansion, had returned earlier than usual. He still wore his dark gray Armani suit, his tie loosened, the gleam of a Patek Philippe watch catching the light. He was a well-known tech millionaire, often featured in financial papers like Forbes and the Wall Street Journal. But since the day his wife died, wealth had brought him no joy. The sight before him made Daniel freeze. His daughter knelt in the middle of a puddle, her dress filthy, while Margaret stood tall, red heels sparkling beside her. Daniel strode in, his voice heavy with anger. "What is going on here?" Margaret turned at once, a smile flashing on her lips in a split second. Her tone softened, as if nothing about the scene was wrong. "Darling, the child spilled water. I only wanted her to learn neatness. Children need to be taught discipline through small things." Daniel's eyes fixed on Margaret, then dropped to Emily. The little girl lifted her face, her eyes pleading, her lips trembling but silent. In that gaze, Daniel saw her fear, and he saw Sarah's reflection, so vivid it made his heart clench painfully. He stepped closer, bending down to lift Emily, but when his hand touched her shoulder, he froze. A familiar sensation rushed back, the image of his late wife, Sarah, sitting by the piano, her golden hair falling softly, her radiant smile as she taught Emily the very first notes. He remembered Sarah sitting on the hospital bed, her frail hand gripping his, whispering, "Promise me, no matter what happens, don't ever leave her alone." But that promise, Daniel had failed to keep. Sarah's death from leukemia had pulled him into an abyss. In the months that followed, he buried himself in work, in parties, in multi-million-dollar deals as a way to escape. Looking at Emily, he saw only the pain of losing Sarah, never the joy. That was why he had let the distance grow. And now, standing before this scene, he still couldn't find the strength to break it. Daniel stepped back, leaning against the leather chair nearby. His voice sank low. "All right, Emily, get up." Margaret approached, placing a hand on her husband's shoulder, smiling gently. "You see, the girl needs a bit of strictness to grow up. I always want what's best for her. Daniel stayed silent, but his heart felt as if it were being crushed. His eyes dropped to the tattered pink and blue dress, the very one he had once bought from Ralph Lauren for Emily's 4th birthday. Now it was stained, faded, stripped of the brightness it once carried. He sighed and turned away. But just then, his gaze landed on the cleaning rag. A red stain spread across the dirty gray. He looked back at his daughter's small hand, her swollen fingers raw and bleeding. Daniel clenched his fists. His whole body trembled with anger and regret. But then, he loosened again, retreating another step. The shadow of exhaustion and emptiness that had haunted him for so long dragged him down once more. Inside him, a heavy darkness swelled, like a storm waiting to break. Daniel bent down and picked the rag up from the tiled floor. The red stain had seeped deep, clinging cold to his hand like an accusation. He placed the rag into the bucket, then took Emily's small hand and washed it under the warm water of the bathroom sink near the kitchen. The little girl flinched slightly but did not cry. She only whispered softly, "I'm fine." Daniel looked at the bleeding scrape, took a Band-Aid from the drawer, and wrapped it carefully. He wanted to ask many things, but his throat was tight. At last, he only said, "Go rest in your room. I'll check on you tonight." Emily nodded and stepped back into the dark hallway. Margaret walked over, placing her hand on Daniel's shoulder, her voice sweet as honey. "You've worked hard all day. Let me handle the rest." He removed her hand without a word. The faint sound of Daniel's shoes echoed along the wooden hallway. He climbed the stairs and stopped in front of the door that had been locked since Sarah's death. The key still lay in the desk drawer, untouched for months. That night, he did not sleep. He opened the drawer, took the key, and returned to the door. The lock gave way with a soft click. Sarah's room opened with a thread-thin snap. The old air filled his lungs at once, carrying the faint perfume she used to wear. Daniel did not turn on all the lights. He left only a small yellow lamp in the corner, enough to see her favorite shawl hanging on the back of a chair and the silver frame sitting on the vanity. He touched the frame, a fine layer of dust clinging to his fingertips. Daniel pulled open the nightstand drawer. A thin envelope slid off the edge, falling to rest at the tip of his shoe. On the front was Sarah's gentle handwriting, "To Daniel." He sat down on the edge of the bed and opened the envelope with trembling fingers. The paper quivered with his breathing, the slanted script like a whisper not yet gone. "If I am no longer here, please protect Emily. Do not place your trust in the wrong hands. Our daughter's eyes will tell you the truth." He read slowly, as if touching an old stitch. The memories did not come like a replayed film, but in clear fragments. The years of infertility, the endless appointments, each failed pregnancy test leaving Sarah thinner. Daniel loved his wife so much he wished he could carry the exhaustion for her, yet all he could do was sit beside her, hold her hand, and count the days. Then the miracle came, a pregnancy fragile as a thread. They learned to live lightly, move slowly, obey every word of the doctor. Emily was born weak, placed in an incubator, while Sarah was left drained. Daniel stood outside the glass, learning to sterilize bottles, to speak to a tiny life with a steady, warm voice, learning even to swallow his tears so his wife would not worry. They had passed through days like that, diligent and tender, believing hardship had finally left them. Then, when Emily turned 5, leukemia struck. The hospital became their home again. Transfusions, tests, prescriptions repeating endlessly. Sarah still smiled, but her strength left her body like leaves falling from a branch. Daniel looked down at the paper, then raised his eyes to the empty stretch of wall where a family photo once hung, taken during one of their rare, quiet summers. He set the letter on the pillow, turned the small frame on the table so he could look straight into the eyes from memory, not to cling to the past, but to face a truth. He had stepped back when he should have stood firm. "I didn't keep my promise," he said quietly, as if recording his own statement. "I let you carry the burden alone because of my fear." The words fell softly, not loud, not dramatic, but they stayed heavy, as if this was the first time he dared to name his failure. He stood and opened the small wooden box where Sarah had once kept a few simple pieces of jewelry. The pearl necklace wasn't there. Daniel clenched his fist, exhaled slowly. Margaret's image in a red dress, with the necklace flashed in his mind, sharp as if it had happened only minutes ago. He closed the box, placed it back exactly where it belonged, then turned toward the small desk in the corner, where Sarah's notebook still held her notes on raising their child. On the marked page, she had written, "When your child is afraid, don't ask what they did wrong. Ask what they had to endure." Daniel closed the notebook, took the letter with him, and stepped out of the room. He locked the door, slipped the key into his pocket. The hallway was dim, the night light casting a pale yellow streak across the wall. Emily stood there, holding a cup of water with both hands. She didn't speak, only looked up at him. Her large eyes, wet and silent, carried a light mixed with fear and hope. Daniel knelt to meet her, at eye level. He wanted to say everything would be fine, but an empty promise would only break more than it could mend. He chose a different way, calmer. "Does your hand still hurt?" he asked, his voice low and steady. Emily shook her head. "Are you thirsty?" She nodded slightly. "Go back to your room, drink slowly, then lie down. I'll sit out here for a while." Emily looked at him for another second, searching his eyes for something unspoken, then turned away, clutching her cup, walking slowly toward her room. Daniel stood, leaned back against the wall. The letter in his coat pocket seemed to burn. He pulled out his phone, scrolled through his contacts until he reached Jacob Reynolds. Jacob had been a college friend, now a family attorney, the one who had helped Daniel and Sarah establish the Sarah Foundation for children with blood disorders. His finger hovered, not pressing the call. Tonight wasn't the time. He needed to hear one more thing, from Emily herself. He walked closer to his daughter's door, stopped just outside. Inside, the faint rustle of blankets reached him. Daniel didn't open the door. He didn't want to startle her. He simply stood, listening to the breathing of a child, trying to put herself to sleep after a day of being forced to endure things she couldn't understand why adults could be so cruel. He placed a hand over his chest, feeling the pulse beat into his palm. "Her eyes will tell you the truth." Sarah's words returned once more, clearer now, firmer. Daniel looked down at the floor where no watermarks lay, only a faint sheen, as if left by someone about to step out of their silence. He turned away, left the hallway, and went downstairs. The kitchen light dimmed, the house fell back into quiet, but this quiet felt different. It wasn't thick and suffocating anymore. It opened into a space where something real could begin. As Daniel passed the top of the stairs, he heard Emily's door creak open. She peeked out, saying nothing, just staring straight at him, her eyes trembling yet bright. Daniel stopped, stood still, and knew he had received a second message not on paper, but in his child's gaze. Emily's door closed softly. Daniel stood still at the bottom of the stairs for a moment, then turned toward the kitchen. He lit the stove, warmed the chicken soup in the Le Creuset pot, poured it into a white porcelain bowl, and set out bread and a bit of salad. The part-time housekeeper, Donna Hayes, had left earlier in the afternoon. Tonight the house was quiet, the only sound in the kitchen the faint tap of the spoon against the bowl. He placed 3 sets of silverware on the table, poured water, then called gently, "Dinner's ready, Emily." Margaret appeared first, her red dress still hugging her figure, her smile already prepared. She opened the wine cabinet, ran her finger along a few bottles, then chose a red and poured herself a glass. "This looks wonderful, darling. I'll fix a plate for her," she said, her voice warm enough to fool anyone not paying close attention. Emily came down, her hands clasped together. She perched on the edge of her chair, back straight, eyes fixed on the spoon in front of her as if counting her breaths. Margaret leaned over, spooned some mashed potatoes and a little chicken onto her plate. "Eat, sweetheart. You need to grow strong and neat," Emily whispered. "Thank you." She lifted her sleeve slightly so it wouldn't touch the food. As the fabric slid past her wrist, a patch of blue and purple skin showed. Daniel saw it clearly. He set his spoon down and looked straight at his daughter. "What happened to you, Emily?" Emily froze, the hand holding her spoon trembling. She lowered her eyes, as if wanting to hide her entire arm under the table. Before she could speak, Margaret smiled smoothly. She tripped on the stairs. "Kids get scrapes, that's all. I already put some cream on it." Daniel didn't respond. He kept his eyes on Emily. She swallowed hard, tried to eat a small bite. The sound of it carried through the silence. He wanted to press her further, but suddenly his throat burned dry, as if something blocked his voice. Margaret leaned in, steering the conversation away with practiced ease. "Tomorrow I'll take her shopping for a few new outfits. She's growing so fast. By the way, what's your schedule like next week? I'll help organize things." Emily reached for a piece of bread, her left hand gripping the edge of the chair so tightly her knuckles turned white. Daniel noticed every small movement. He lifted his glass, took a sip of water to buy time, but the taste only reminded him of the letter in his jacket pocket from the night before. He turned toward his daughter, lowered his voice so only she could hear. "If you're hurt, you tell me." Emily glanced up for an instant, then dropped her eyes again, whispering as if afraid to lose her breath. "I'm fine." Dinner moved slowly. Margaret talked about a fundraising event in town, mentioned a few acquaintances, laughed at the right moments, and laid her hand over Daniel's while speaking about responsibility. Daniel gently removed her hand, stood, and began clearing the table. Emily immediately rose, too, carrying her plate. "Leave it, sweetheart," he said. "I'll take care of it." Margaret glanced sideways, her sweet tone thinning like a blade. "Let the girl help a little. She needs to learn." Daniel didn't argue. He simply took the plate from Emily's hands and gave her a dry towel. "Wipe your hands and go read for a while in your room." Emily nodded, accepted the towel, and met his eyes for a second. In hers was something that looked both extinguished and stubbornly alive, like a candle shrinking against the wind. When the kitchen was finally clean, Daniel turned off most of the lights, leaving only a single golden glow in the corner. He walked through the living room and stopped by the piano. The lid was still closed. He set his hand lightly on it, pulled back, then went upstairs. The hallway was darker than usual. He paused outside Emily's door and drew a deep breath. Inside, there was no voice, only a silence stretched thin. Daniel raised his hand, ready to knock. He froze, reminding himself of the hollow promises he refused to repeat. He stood there, waiting for some sign from within. After a moment, the faint sound of sniffling reached him. Not full sobs, but something strangled back so tightly, it sounded like it might tear the throat apart. A weight pressed down on Daniel's chest. He laid his hand on the doorknob, let go, then reached again. Finally, he sat down on the small chair by the wall, like a nameless guard keeping watch. The soft click of high heels echoed at the far end of the hall. Margaret approached, her shadow gliding across the strip of light from the wall lamp. She stopped beside Daniel, tilting her head as if whispering something caring. He rose to his feet, stepping half a pace away. Margaret leaned her face toward the door, her voice falling into a thin, cold thread. "Remember what I told you. One word to your dad, and your mother's ashes will be gone from this house." The sob inside cut off instantly, strangled. Daniel closed his eyes, his fingers curling into fists until the knuckles went white. He opened them and stared at Margaret. She smiled, innocent as if she hadn't spoken a word, then turned and walked away, her heels striking evenly against the wood. Daniel didn't follow. He stood before his daughter's door, spine straight, one hand pressed to his chest to steady his breath. Sarah's words from the letter came back to him, no longer a request, but a command. He tilted his head, speaking softly, just enough for the girl inside to hear without frightening her. "I'm here." The hallway went silent. Then came a trembling breath, lighter than before. Daniel sat back on the chair, waiting until Emily's breathing steadied. He knew that tonight he still wouldn't have all the answers, but he finally had something he had long been missing. A boundary had been drawn, and he would cross it. At the end of the hall, Daniel's phone buzzed. The name on the screen was Jacob Reynolds. He looked at the familiar number, realizing the time for silence had run out. The phone vibrated in his hand, Jacob Reynolds' name flashing on the screen. Daniel stared at it for a few seconds, then muted the call and typed a short reply. "See you tomorrow morning." He slipped the phone into his pocket and turned toward the hallway. From Margaret's office, a desk lamp glowed faintly. The door was left ajar. Inside, her voice was low and quick, as if afraid of waking someone. "He's weak. Just a little more." "Yes, I understand." Daniel stopped at the crack of the door. The whispers broke off in fragments, but it was enough for him to know who was on the other end. The way she addressed him, the pause before answering, and the stifled laugh, all of it was familiar. He walked away without a sound. Inside him, a boundary line had just been drawn thicker. The next morning, Richard Barnes arrived. Daniel's younger brother by a few years, perfectly tailored in a suit, smiling as though the sunlight itself had followed him through the door. Richard carried a large gift box, its glossy wrapping catching the light. "Good morning, brother. Good morning, princess," he said, setting the box on the table. "I brought you something." Emily had been sitting in a chair reading, but at the sound of footsteps she closed her book and slipped behind the sofa. Her small hand clutched the edge of the fabric tightly. Margaret followed Richard in, her voice bright and pleasant. "See, Richard always thinks of family," she said warmly. Daniel stood at the head of the table, watching every movement without missing a beat. He turned to his daughter. "Aren't you going to thank Uncle Richard?" Emily shook her head, eyes fixed on the floor. "I don't want to." Richard froze for a second, then forced a laugh, spreading his hands as if to take the blame. "Kids, you know, just a little shy. It's fine." He pulled out a chair and sat down, turning to Margaret. "When you called yesterday, the signal was so bad." Margaret caught Daniel's gaze. The smile on her lips stayed, but the corners of her eyes tightened. "Oh, I was asking about next week's charity event," she replied lightly. "Richard has connections with the education fund. He wants to help Emily have a good environment." Daniel said nothing. He poured a glass of water and slid it toward Emily. She took it with both hands and whispered, "Thank you, Dad." Richard opened the gift box and pulled out an expensive doll with a full set of accessories. He tried to make his voice cheerful. "Sweetheart, come here. Let me show you how to dress the doll." Emily didn't move. She pressed deeper against the back of the sofa, her hair covering half her face. Her small hand instinctively tugged at her sleeve to hide the bruises on her wrist. Daniel saw it, and he also saw Richard notice. In that moment, the corner of Richard's mouth curved ever so slightly, like the familiar crease of a man who had already won many small games and was waiting for the big one. At dinner, Margaret set the table and told Donna to leave early. She chose the wine, poured evenly, her steps quick, her storytelling voice soft. "I think our family should take a weekend trip. You're too tense." Richard said there's a new resort near the lake. Quiet. A place where Emily could have a change of scenery. Daniel chewed slowly, listening but not nodding. Emily ate little, occasionally glancing at him as if searching for a signal. Richard raised his glass toward Daniel, his voice lowered with a tone of intimacy. "Brother, you work too much. Sometimes you should rest and let others share the burden." The words dropped onto the table like a small pebble, but the ripples spread far. Daniel set down his knife and fork, wiped his hands with a napkin. He looked at Richard, then glanced briefly at Margaret. Richard's smile widened as he clinked glasses with her. "Family is meant to lean on one another," he said, his eyes never leaving Daniel. "How would you share it?" Daniel asked quietly, as if the matter were unimportant. "Well, the paperwork, the management, the things that wear you down, Margaret and I can step in," Richard replied, his voice carrying a mix of care and casualness, as if offering something harmless. "You'd have your hands free. You could stay home with your daughter. We'll handle the hard parts." Emily put her spoon down, her small hand curling into her lap. Daniel heard the sound of the spoon touching the plate, so clearly it seemed the only sound in the room. He leaned over and poured more water for his daughter. "Drink this," he said, then looked back at Richard. "I'll think about it." Margaret cut in, her voice as soft as silk. "No rush. What matters is that you get some rest." Richard raised his glass again, his eyes gleaming, his smile flawless. "Then for your health and for Emily's future, you should rest and let others share the burden." His gaze lingered on Margaret a beat too long, as if sending a silent message. Daniel shuddered, not from the wine, but from the sense that one door had just closed behind him and another was opening in front, leading into a room where he would be forced to choose sides. Daniel set his glass down, looked straight at his younger brother, while his other hand gripped his phone tightly under the table. On the screen, a message from Jacob had just appeared. "Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock, my office." Jacob's message was still lit on the screen. The next morning, at 8:58, Daniel pushed open the door to a small office on Main Street. Inside, Jacob Reynolds rose to greet him, of medium build, steady eyes, the calm voice of a family lawyer who had seen more turmoil than the rumors suggested. "Have a seat, Daniel," he said, cutting straight to the point. "Tell me everything." Daniel kept it brief, no more avoiding. When he finished, Jacob nodded, lifted the phone, and called someone. "Frank, I need you." 10 minutes later, Sheriff Frank Dalton walked in. He was in his early 50s, broad-shouldered, sun-weathered skin, the steady gaze of a man used to trouble without losing his sense of fairness. He shook Daniel's hand, speaking slow and clear. "I'm here to protect a child. Say directly what you want done." The plan was simple, but solid. They would place a legal recording device in the home's shared space, the living room where Daniel, as homeowner, had full authority. The device would only activate when sound crossed a set threshold, and all data would be sealed as evidence. Daniel nodded. "Margaret has a spa appointment at noon," he said. "We'll have 1 hour." That noon, the back door of the mansion opened. Jacob and Frank entered with Daniel, making no noise. The sheriff quickly scanned the corners of the room, then mounted the tiny device on top of the bookshelf, disguised as a smoke detector. Jacob tested the signal. A light blinked once, then went dark. "It's working," he said. "Now just act normal, and don't take your eyes off the girl if you can help it. If needed, we'll come immediately." Daniel walked them to the door. Before leaving, Frank placed a firm hand on his shoulder, giving it a light squeeze. "Stop blaming yourself any further. Your job now is to trust the girl and to trust yourself." Daniel nodded. He stood on the porch steps, watching the two men leave, then turned back inside. Emily was sitting on the staircase, clutching a book to her chest. She looked at him as if asking, but too afraid to voice it. Daniel moved closer, gently brushed her hair. "This afternoon I'll need to step out for a while," he said softly, only for her to hear. "But I'll be close." Emily nodded, her eyes blinking fast. At exactly 3 o'clock, Daniel picked up his car keys. Margaret appeared in a new dress, her perfume sharper than usual. "You've got a meeting?" she asked, lips curling faintly. "Good. I have a few lessons for Emily." Daniel paused for a beat, then opened the door. "Don't teach her things that make her afraid," he answered slowly. She kept the smile, but a cold glint flashed in her eyes. The door shut behind him. Daniel slid into the car seat, not starting the engine yet. His phone buzzed. A message from Jacob. "I'm listening live. Stay calm. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. 15 minutes. Daniel finally started the car, drove out onto the street, and parked in a lot across from the park, keeping just the right distance. The sun dragged the shadows longer. His phone buzzed again. This time, an audio file came through the secure app. Daniel played it, pressing the phone to his ear. A chair scraped hard across the floor. Then Margaret's voice, stripped of all sweetness. "Neil, clean it. Don't look at me like that." A child's labored breath, the sound of a rag wrung out. Daniel's grip tightened on the steering wheel. The next word slammed into his chest. "If you open your mouth, your mother's ashes will scatter on the street." The silence after that sentence was so heavy that Daniel thought he had stopped breathing. Then came Emily's muffled sob. The little girl pleaded in broken whispers, "Please don't. I won't say anything." Daniel turned off the engine, opened the door, stepped out of the car, then got back in, like a man who suddenly remembered the cliff in front of him. He called Jacob. The line was picked up immediately. "I heard it," Jacob said, his voice dry but steady. "Daniel, stay exactly where you are. Frank is requesting an emergency protection order. Do not confront her now, or she will twist the story. Let us come in the right way." Daniel leaned his head against the seat, his hand covering his eyes. His chest ached as if someone had punched him straight on. An image of Sarah on her hospital bed flashed before him, her words, "Don't leave the girl alone," cutting open the wound again. He drew a deep breath, forcing his breathing back into rhythm. "Hurry," he said into the phone. "I don't want another sentence like that spoken inside my house." Evening fell, shadows lengthening along the sidewalk. Daniel drove back to Jacob's office. As soon as the door closed, he plugged the audio file into the large speaker. Frank stood beside him, arms crossed, listening from beginning to end without interrupting once. When the recording stopped, the room fell into a short silence. Daniel placed both hands on the table and bowed his head. "I let my daughter hear words like that inside her own home," he said, his voice hoarse. Jacob stepped forward and laid a thin folder in front of him. "This is the official report. I'll file it immediately." "Daniel," he looked him straight in the eye, "you have to face this. Not just for the girl, but for Sarah too." Frank nodded, slow and firm. "Tonight, I'll patrol near your place. Tomorrow morning, if the judge signs the protection order, we go in. Keep Emily with you. Under no circumstances let her be alone with that woman." Daniel folded the folder, his hands no longer shaking. He stood up, gave a short thank you, and left the office. That night, when the lights in the house went out one by one, he sat alone before the small altar holding Sarah's picture. The candle burned steady, its glow reflecting on the glass frame. "I swear," Daniel said slowly, each word striking down like a nail into wood, "I will not let you down one more time." The flame flickered softly. In his eyes, a small light had awakened, fragile but steadfast, like a storm finally finding its direction. The candle in front of Sarah's photo was fading out. Daniel stood up, slipped the letter into his jacket pocket, and walked straight to his study. He turned on the desk lamp, arranged the files neatly on the walnut desk, and placed them beside his Mont Blanc fountain pen. That night he did not sleep. He only sat listening to the Patek clock tick with each beat, waiting for morning. Before 9 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Margaret entered first, wearing a dark dress, her smile gentle. Richard followed, carrying a leather folder. He placed it on the desk and opened it, revealing thick paper documents. "Brother, this is the restructuring plan," Richard said warmly. "You should rest. Let us carry the heavy load." Margaret sat opposite, her hand lightly touching Daniel's wrist as if in a caring gesture. "You've been working too much. Let us share it with you. I will take care of Emily as if she were my own child." She turned to the little girl. "Come, sit closer to your mother." Emily stood at the doorway, clutching the hem of her dress. She did not move. Daniel pulled the chair beside him and said softly, "Sit here." The girl obeyed, sitting upright, her eyes fixed on the desk. Richard slid the first page toward Daniel. "It's just management authorization. Nothing affects ownership," he said, his tone as light as offering tea. Daniel turned the page, reading slowly. Dense sentences, replacement clauses, supplemental annexes. Margaret poured coffee and set the cup in front of him. "Drink a little. Don't let your health fail," she said. Her eyes flickered toward Emily, then stopped on the shiny pen resting on the desk. Daniel thanked her, lifted the cup, then set it down. He picked up his phone, pretending to check his meeting schedule. Beneath the table, the child's hand brushed his. When he looked down, Emily had slipped a small folded paper into his palm. It was creased in haste, trembling. He opened it and saw 4 thin words, fragile as thread. "Daddy, don't sign." Daniel's chest tightened. He folded the note, tucked it into his sleeve, then lifted his gaze. "All right," he said evenly. "Show me everything." Richard smiled, pushing 3 more folders across the desk. Margaret leaned back and exhaled as though relieved. "Wonderful, you understand us." Daniel kept reading, marking certain sections with a pencil. He turned a page and asked a few technical questions to keep the mood natural. Section 5.3 transfers the authority for senior personnel decisions to the authorized party. "Who is that?" Richard answered immediately. "It's a council of 3, myself, Margaret, and an independent advisor." Margaret nodded, smiling kindly. "It's only to free your hands, nothing more." Daniel closed the folder and leaned back. "Do I need to sign all this today?" Richard glanced idly at his watch, creating a sense of urgency. "The sooner the better, so it's ready for next quarter's decisions." Margaret added another layer of sweetness. "Once you sign, you'll have time to enjoy being with your daughter. I'll take care of everything else." Daniel nodded. "All right, I'll sign." He picked up a pen, twisted the cap, and tested the ink with a quick stroke. Richard leaned forward, satisfied. "Just sign each page where it's marked." Daniel set the pen down, lifted his phone as if switching it to silent mode. In that movement, he quickly snapped a photo of the page, the shutter sound faint as a breath. He shifted the angle, pretended to read carefully, and snapped again. By the time he was through the 2 files, he had nearly all the key clauses stored. Margaret stood to pour more coffee. "I'll call Donna to get lunch ready." Daniel nodded without looking up. As soon as the door closed, he glanced at Richard, then lowered his voice evenly. "Give me 10 minutes to finish reading. After that, I'll sign them all at once." Richard raised his brows, smiling. "Suit yourself." Daniel gathered the files and stood. "I'll go into Sarah's room. I mean the study, so I can focus." Richard waved him off. "Go ahead." Daniel carried the papers inside and shut the door. He didn't sit down, only lifted his phone and sent the photos to Jacob with a single line. "Check now." In less than 5 minutes, Jacob called back. His voice was calm but sharp. "This isn't management authorization. It's a disguised transfer of ownership. Clauses 5.3 and 7.2 give them control over your personal assets, even Sarah's trust. Appendix C activates permanently if you step away from operations for more than 60 days. If you sign, you lose everything." Daniel leaned his forehead against the door, eyes closed. "I hear you," Jacob continued. "Don't confront them yet. Tell them to leave the documents. Say it needs notarization, or that an independent advisor has to review it. I'll file an emergency injunction to block the transfer. And Daniel, keep Emily close." Daniel opened his eyes, his hand resting on the pocket where Sarah's letter lay. "I understand." He walked back out. Richard looked up, his ready smile in place. "Finished already?" Daniel set the files back on the desk, his voice steady as if nothing had shifted. "I'll sign after an independent advisor reviews them. Company procedure requires it." Richard raised his brows again, his smile thinning. "No need for all that," Margaret returned, a glass of water still in her hand. "You don't trust me and Richard?" Daniel looked straight at her, then at Emily, who sat quietly with her hands clasped together. He spoke slowly, firmly. "I trust procedure." He slid the files toward Richard. "Leave them here. I'll respond this afternoon." The air grew heavy. Richard's smile faded, though his tone stayed warm. "All right, brother, but don't miss the opportunity." He stood, closed the leather folder, then opened it again as if absent-mindedly. "Oh, I'll just need your signature on a few internal documents first. Only routine." Daniel shook his head. "This afternoon." Margaret walked toward Emily, leaning down to touch the girl's shoulder. "Go on upstairs." Emily jumped to her feet, stepping aside to avoid her hand. Daniel placed his hand on his daughter's back and guided her to the door. "Stay in the library." She nodded and hurried off. Now only the 3 adults remained. Daniel kept his tone even. "I have a call at noon. Let's stop here." Richard nodded, his eyes flicking briefly to the pen on the table. "See you this afternoon then." They left the office, the sound of footsteps fading down the hall. The door clicked shut, leaving only the ticking clock in the room. Daniel sat down, opened the drawer, and placed Sarah's letter beside the files. He looked at the slanted handwriting, still warm with her presence. "Your child's eyes will tell you the truth." Outside, the heavy front door echoed, signaling Richard's car had left the driveway. His phone buzzed, a message from Jacob. "The injunction is ready. Sending it to the judge now. Don't sign anything." Daniel replied. "Understood." He gripped the edge of the desk, feeling 2 forces tearing inside him. One the habit of silence, the other a new, steady voice of a father. He rose and looked through the glass toward the end of the hallway where Emily had just disappeared. A question rang clear in his mind, impossible to push aside. Will you stay silent, or will you stand up? Right after Richard left the gate, Daniel called Jacob. Tonight, Jacob answered briefly. The protective order and the limited search warrant are in place. Frank will be waiting outside. Daniel hung up and walked straight into the living room. He placed a small speaker on top of the bookshelf, tested the volume, then slipped the remote device into his pocket. Donna had received her instructions, prepared a simple dinner, and left early. The house was down to 3 people. Daniel stopped by the library door. Emily was holding a book, her eyes lifted in quiet anticipation. He spoke softly. "Tonight you sit next to me. You don't have to be afraid." The girl nodded, her small hand gripping the edge of the page. At 7 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Richard walked in with a wide smile. Margaret followed close, in a new dress, the familiar scent of her perfume surrounding her. "A family gathered, just like you wished," Richard said, setting a bottle of wine on the table. Margaret glanced quickly across the table, her eyes pausing on the neatly placed pen in the corner. Then she smiled. "After dinner we'll sign, won't we, darling? I want everything settled so you can rest easy." Daniel pulled out a chair for Emily and sat down beside her. Dinner began. Margaret cheerfully told stories about the weekend resort. Richard chimed in, occasionally glancing at the leather briefcase as if to drop a hint. Emily ate slowly, her eyes moving from her father to the folder cover. Daniel kept the conversation measured, making no promises. When dessert was served, Richard raised his glass, his voice warm. "To your health, to Emily's future. From now on, we'll share the burden." Margaret clinked her glass, then turned to Daniel with a waiting smile. Daniel raised his glass too, but his other hand, inside his pocket, rested on the remote device. He looked at Emily for a moment, then pressed. A voice echoed from the corner of the room, chillingly clear. "If you dare speak, your mother's ashes will scatter on the street." No one moved. Not a single fork or knife clinked. The sound cut the air in two and hung there. Margaret's face stiffened, her eyes blinking rapidly as if searching for an excuse. Emily burst into tears, covering her face with both hands, her body trembling. Daniel set his glass down and pulled her against his shoulder. Richard ground his teeth. "You dare set a trap for me?" Daniel stood, still holding his daughter. His voice was steady and firm. "This isn't a trap. I only let everyone hear the truth." He fixed his gaze on Margaret. "Those words were yours, in this very house, to a 7-year-old child." Margaret took a deep breath, forcing her smile back into place. "The audio was doctored. I was only teaching the girl to be polite. She made it up to drive a wedge between us." She stepped forward half a pace but froze when Daniel shielded Emily with his body. He spoke slowly. "There's a timestamp, a location, a certified audio expert, and a court order. Nobody made it up." Richard slammed his hand on the table. "You want to humiliate me?" Daniel turned toward his brother, his voice steady. "If you want to insult someone, say it plainly. But here, I'm talking about my daughter." 3 short knocks echoed, then the door opened. Sheriff Frank Dalton stepped in with 2 men in brown uniforms. "Frank Dalton, Gallatin County Sheriff," he introduced briefly. "This is Deputy Michael Grant and Marshal Andrew Fletcher." His eyes swept the room quickly, stopping on Emily trembling in her father's arms, then shifted back to Margaret and Richard. Jacob followed behind them, holding a file folder. He nodded to Daniel and said clearly, "We are serving a child protection order and a limited search warrant for the common areas. The audio evidence and additional testimony will be sealed." Margaret backed up half a step, her voice rising. "You have no right to barge into my home like this." Frank unfolded a paper and read aloud, each word firm. "An order signed by a judge this morning. Mrs. Margaret Ellis is under investigation for child abuse. Mr. Richard Barnes is under investigation for conspiracy to commit fraud and making threats." Deputy Grant moved forward, cuffing her professionally but without violence. Margaret struggled, shouting, "Daniel, say something." Daniel shook his head, pulling Emily tighter into his chest. "That's enough." Richard stepped back, his eyes narrowing as if weighing an escape. Marshal Fletcher blocked his path, speaking calmly. "Sir, please cooperate with us." Richard glanced around, swallowed his rage, then turned to Daniel. His gaze darkened, his voice pressed like a saw against wood. "You'll pay for this." Daniel didn't respond. He bent low to whisper to his daughter. "Close your eyes. Lean on me." Emily obeyed, her tear-streaked face pressed against his shoulder. Frank tilted his head toward Daniel, speaking softly. "She's safe now. Tonight we'll assign patrols. Tomorrow the court will hear the temporary order." Margaret screamed as she was led toward the door, her shoes scraping across the floor. Richard followed, his back still rigid, but the look he cast over his shoulder cut like a blade. The door closed, and the last echoes fell silent. The room stood empty, filled only with the trembling breath of a child and the slowing heartbeat of her father. Jacob placed the folder on the table and slid it toward Daniel. "We'll continue tomorrow. Tonight, stay with your daughter." Daniel nodded, his voice rough. Thank you. Frank signaled his deputies to make a quick sweep of the house, then turned at the doorway. Lock everything tight. If anyone comes, call me. The house quieted. Daniel sat down, holding Emily on his lap. Her sobs slowly softened, though she still startled now and then. He took a warm cloth and gently wiped her face, whispering over and over, "No one will touch you again. I'm here." Through the window, the fading streak of red and blue from the patrol cars stretched across the wall, then vanished. In the heavy stillness, Daniel looked up. He knew a storm had just passed, but the sky wasn't clear yet, because Richard's look still lingered somewhere in that room, a threat that hadn't dissolved. Daniel held Emily close, remembering Richard's words. "You'll pay for this." The hatred in his eyes clung to Daniel's mind like a hooked iron. Daniel understood. The battle wasn't finished. But this time, he had stood up, and he would not take a single step back again. The night began with the sound of the lock turning firmly. Daniel carried Emily upstairs, dimmed most of the lights, leaving only a small, warm glow at the head of the bed. The girl curled up under the blanket, her breath still uneven. The phone vibrated. Jacob called briefly. "The protection order is in effect. Tomorrow morning is the preliminary hearing. I and your assistant, Nora Bennett, will be present. You stay home with your daughter," Daniel replied. "Thank you." He set the phone down, sat beside the bed again, and gently touched his daughter's sweat-damp hair. At midnight, Emily jolted up, her eyes wide open in the dark. "I'm scared. Mom won't forgive me because I didn't protect the urn." Her voice cracked, trembling like a string pulled too tight. Daniel pulled her into his arms, keeping his breathing steady, speaking slowly so each word clung to the next. "Your mother doesn't need ashes to be with us. She is always here, in the hearts of both you and me. You didn't do anything wrong." Emily pressed her face against his chest, listening to his heartbeat, slowly calming down. The next morning, Jacob sent a message. The judge approved temporary detention. Margaret has been indicted for child abuse. Richard faces charges of conspiracy to commit fraud and threats. Nora is sending you the report. Daniel did not go to court. He made warm milk for Emily, sat with her at the breakfast table, letting the pure silence of the morning gently ease them both. For 3 consecutive nights, the nightmares kept returning. Each time Emily woke up in a panic, Daniel was there, handing her a glass of water, resting his hand on her back, repeating the familiar words, "Daddy is here." On the 4th day, he took Emily to meet the psychologist, Leah Simmons. She was in her early 40s, her brown hair tied low, her voice deep and warm. Her office had little furniture, only a bookshelf, a small sand tray, and a few boxes of crayons. Leah introduced herself gently. "I'm Leah. Here, no one is forced to do anything they don't want to." She turned to Emily. "You can call me Miss Leah." Emily hesitated. "Hello, Miss." Leah handed her a card with a picture of a guitar. "Do you like music?" Emily nodded slightly. "My mom used to teach me," Leah smiled. "Then today we'll practice breathing like counting beats in a song. 1, 2, 3, hold. Then breathe out, release it slowly, like a long note." During the first session, Emily spoke little, but her eyes startled less when Leah showed her how to give names to feelings. "What color is fear like?" Emily answered very softly. "Gray." "And safety?" "Yellow." Leah nodded. "When you feel the gray coming, look for something yellow. It can be your father's hand." In the days that followed, Daniel studied alongside his daughter. He wrote down in a notebook the words he needed to say, never making empty promises, never rushing to soothe. He practiced standing behind her when she trembled, letting Emily turn to him on her own, rather than overwhelming her with a too tight embrace. He also learned how to apologize at the right time. Every night, before turning off the light, he said the same sentence. "Today I was here. Tomorrow I will still be here." One afternoon, just after father and daughter had returned from Leah's office, their back neighbor, Mrs. Helen Carter, stopped by. She was in her 60s, retired, once a music teacher at the school, carrying a card and a garage key. "I have an old upright piano," she said kindly. "My daughter brought home a new one, so this one just sits there. I remember Emily used to sit and listen to her mother play. If she wants it, I can have someone move it over." Daniel looked at Emily. The little girl clutched his sleeve, then whispered, "I want to." Helen smiled, her wrinkled eyes lighting up like a streak of sunlight. "Tomorrow evening they can bring it over." The piano arrived, set in the corner of the living room where Sarah used to sit. Daniel did not rush to open the lid. He waited for Emily to touch it first. She climbed onto the bench, her back still slightly hunched, but her fingers managed to rest on the white keys. The first note came out thin, then stumbled, then fell silent. Emily pulled her hands back and glanced at Daniel. He nodded. Slowly. "We are not in a contest." She bit her lip, touched the keys again, this time a simple chord. It was not perfect music, but it was a small bridge stretched across the empty space. Night fell, most of the lights turned off. Emily sat on the rug, leaning against the bench, hugging her knees. Daniel brought out 2 cups of milk and handed her one. She took a sip, set the cup down, then looked up. "Dad." "Yes." "Do you regret that I look like Mom?" The question pierced like a small, sharp needle, cutting through every layer of defense. Daniel froze for half a beat. He set his own cup on the table, not rushing to answer. His chest tightened, but he kept his face calm so Emily would not panic. Slowly, he pulled a chair closer, sat down at her eye level, his hands interlaced to keep them from shaking. In that just enough silence, he knew it was time to answer the hardest question of his life. Daniel pulled the chair closer, placed both hands on his knees to steady himself, then spoke slowly and firmly. "I don't regret that you look like your mother. I only regret that I avoided your eyes for too long. From now on, it doesn't matter who you resemble. What matters is that you are safe and happy." Emily looked at him for a long time, as if she wanted to test whether each word could stand on its own. Then she nodded and rested her forehead against his hand. That evening, Daniel lifted the piano lid and played exactly 3 soft chords. Emily placed her hand on the keys beside him, and father and daughter held the note together until the sound faded completely. A year passed in small but steady steps. Emily's therapy journal filled with pages marked yellow. Leah Simmons sometimes sat in the back row of the living room, suggesting a few breathing exercises, and then leaving the father and daughter to talk on their own. Mrs. Helen Carter dropped by every weekend, reminding Daniel to call the tuner for the piano, encouraging Emily when she practiced difficult passages again. At school, Diane Harper, the new music teacher, about 30 years old with a gentle yet firm voice, chose Emily for the spring recital. "Not because you are perfect," she said, "but because you know how to listen to your own heartbeat." On the day of the recital, the high school auditorium was packed with parents. The sound of quiet conversations subsided as the stage lights came on. Daniel sat in the front row, between Leah and Helen. He gripped the edge of his seat tighter each time the roll call drew closer to the end. When the announcer called Emily Mitchell, Daniel half rose from his chair, then quickly sat back down, afraid of distracting his daughter. Emily walked out in a simple pale blue dress, her hair neatly tied back. Her hands trembled, but her steps did not retreat. She bowed to the audience, then tilted her head toward the front row. "Dad," she whispered just loud enough for 2 people to hear, "I will play Mom's song." Daniel gave a small nod, placing his hand over his chest like a renewed promise. Emily sat down, inhaled deeply the way Leah had taught her. She placed her right hand, then her left. The first note sounded, not loud, but steady. The following notes linked together like a traveler walking again on a road where she once fell, this time with stronger steps. In the middle section, her hand faltered for a second, her eyes glistening. Then she continued, on beat. Daniel recognized the small flourish Sarah used to add at the end of every evening, like a gentle caress over their daughter's hair. Emily added the same flourish, not faster, not slower, as if sending a small flower across time. When the final note faded, the auditorium stayed silent for a heartbeat, then erupted. Applause rose to its feet, some whistles, some people wiping their eyes. Daniel stood later than everyone else, because he was busy dabbing his tears with his sleeve. He clapped evenly, never taking his eyes off his daughter. On stage, Emily bowed again, then pressed her arms tightly against herself as if reassuring her own heart that she had done what she needed to do. Backstage, Miss Diane met father and daughter first. "You kept your rhythm, well done," she said, handing Emily a sticker shaped like a musical note. Emily smiled and whispered a thank you. Leah stood a little farther back, only raising her thumb, saying nothing more because she knew what mattered now was the father's voice. Daniel knelt down to his daughter's eye level, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I'm proud of you. Not because you played well, but because you had the courage to step out." Emily threw her arms around him, her voice still shaky but clear. "Daddy, I'm not afraid anymore." Mrs. Helen came last, handing Emily a handkerchief embroidered with the letter H. "A reward from an old teacher," she said with a laugh, her eyes crinkling. Emily accepted it, folded it carefully, and slipped it into the pocket of her dress. Daniel thanked each of them in turn, with a long handshake for Leah, a gentle hug for Mrs. Helen, and a clear, "Thank you, ma'am," to Miss Diane. They all understood a family had just closed one old door. That evening, when father and daughter returned home, Daniel lifted the piano lid. "This time," he said, "you lead." Emily placed her hands and played a small flowing phrase. Daniel followed with a deep chord, grounding the high melody of his daughter. In the sound of the piano, the house seemed to change its rhythm. There were no longer footsteps slipping away, only the steady breathing of two people who had chosen to stay. At the county jail, Richard sat leaning against the wall, gripping a scrap of the local newspaper his lawyer had brought in. A small note, no photo, just one line about the school recital and the list of students. Emily Mitchell, piano solo. He read the name, pressing his lips together until they turned white. The guard walked by, nodding as usual. Richard gave no reply. He folded the clipping, tucked it into his shirt pocket like hiding a paper blade, then lowered his head and whispered, his voice hard as nails, "This isn't over." In the house in Bozeman, the piano had just fallen silent. Emily rested her hands on the keys, smiling at her father. The shadows of the past had not fully disappeared, but the light had found its way, straight and warm, between two people who had learned to call each other by heart. That night, after the last note faded, Emily closed the piano lid with both hands and turned to hug her father tightly. Daniel pressed his forehead against her hair, steadying his breath. The next morning, he opened his laptop, wrote an email declining 3 major contracts, transferred daily operations to his executive team, and requested an extended leave of absence. On the final line, he wrote to the board, "I am prioritizing family. Every strategic decision will go through due process, not the whim of any individual." He hit send, and a strange lightness filled him. That afternoon, father and daughter made lemonade in the kitchen. Emily squeezed the fruit, Daniel stirred. They carried 2 glasses out to the front porch, where the long wooden bench waited. Emily leaned against her father's shoulder and whispered, as if afraid to spill the fragile quiet that had just arrived. "Today I took a nap and didn't dream of anything." Daniel smiled. "Sleep finally thanked you. Life slowed in the best possible way." In the mornings, Emily went to school, taking piano lessons with Miss Diane Harper every Wednesday. On Friday afternoons, Leah Simmons stopped by for 15 minutes to check her breathing exercises and introduce a new game about naming emotions. On weekends, Mrs. Helen Carter brought over fresh pies, always repeating her old joke, a slice of pie for a song. Donna Hayes, the part-time housekeeper, stayed longer to teach Emily how to make hot chocolate. The neighborhood suddenly felt warm, like a blanket woven by many hands. Daniel was no longer standing on the outside. He joined meetings at the Gallatin Family Center, which supported abused children. There, Karen Monroe appeared for the first time to the reader's eye. She was nearly 40. The program coordinator, her hair neatly tied back, her gaze direct yet kind. Karen extended her hand in a firm shake. "I've read the file. We're grateful you stepped forward." Daniel nodded. "I want to do more than just write a check." They got to work. Daniel rallied local businesses to fund a 24/7 hotline, renovated the waiting room to make it warmer, and placed a small bookshelf for children. He reopened the Sarah Fund, dedicating part of its scholarships to young girls who had survived domestic abuse. Sarah's photograph stood in the corner of the fund's office, beneath a small plaque, a place where no one is left alone. Every week, Daniel spent Tuesday evenings with the single parents group, not giving speeches, only speaking plainly. "I used to run away. I only came back because of my daughter's eyes. Sheriff Frank Dalton stopped by the center once, dropping off the schedule for the Child Safety at Home program. Frank smiled, shaking Daniel's hand. This time, you do the talking. I'll sit in the audience. Jacob Reynolds also came, carrying the final stack of papers. The long-term protection order for Emily was complete. Jacob spoke quietly as he left. Just keep living the way you are. The law will take care of the rest. One afternoon, Emily and her father stood in the yard, hanging a small wooden sign on the porch post. On it, Emily had written in white chalk, "House of Music and Lemonade." Her little hand still trembled slightly, but the words were clear. Daniel read it aloud, pretending to declare a proclamation. Approved. Emily giggled and tilted her head. "How many points do I get, Dad?" 10, he said, "because you wrote it with your own hand." News out there still occasionally mentioned the sentence of Margaret and Richard. But in this house, the television stayed low, the piano sounded louder. Emily had grown a little taller, bolder when greeting strangers, taking the initiative to invite a classmate over to paint. For the first time, she dared to leave her bedroom door slightly open while she slept. Every night, Daniel still said the same words before turning off the light. "I'm here today. I'll still be here tomorrow." Now Emily answered back, "I know." Daniel had also changed in ways that adults rarely notice. He learned to respond more slowly, to not decide in anger, to not apologize on behalf of others, but always to apologize when he worried his daughter. Once, Emily asked, "Dad, do you miss Mom?" He didn't avoid it. "I do, but it's a kind of missing that doesn't drag me down anymore, because the two of us are living the way she wanted." Emily nodded and didn't ask further. One evening at sunset, the sky laid a thin orange over the steps. A light breeze, still 2 glasses of lemonade, still the old wooden chair. Emily leaned against her father's shoulder, her voice as soft as a page turning. "Dad, Mom would be proud of us, wouldn't she?" Daniel placed his hand on her back, answering from the deepest place, yet as gently as setting a note exactly where it belonged. "Your eyes saved me, and we will live so that she can smile." They sat like that longer than usual. No need to fill the silence with words. When the dark brushed against the porch, Emily stood up, tugged her father's hand. "Let's go inside and play the opening piece." Daniel nodded. "You lead." Before going in, he glanced back at the Bozeman horizon. Light spread evenly over the far hillside, like a thin cloth someone had just shaken out. Not the light of miracles, but of small right things, repeated every day. The door closed softly behind them, piano keys lifted clear and bright. Dawn doesn't only come in the morning. Sometimes it arrives on a porch, between 2 people who have learned to stay beside each other without fearing the dark. There, healing is not loud, only steady as a heartbeat. And there, a child no longer scrubs floors in fear, but dries the piano keys before beginning a new song. The story does not end with tears, but with music and a promise fulfilled. When Daniel dared to face his own fears, when Emily stepped onto the stage of life, justice also came into the light. The wrongdoers were punished, the good were rewarded, and the most beautiful truth remained that love always finds a way to make things right. That is the message we want to share with you today. In any circumstance, when kindness is planted in the right place, it will bloom. Now, it is your turn. Which moment touched your heart the most? Was it when Emily said, "I am not afraid anymore," or when her father whispered, "Your eyes saved me"? Have you ever witnessed a similar story in real life, where a community stood up to protect a child? If so, share it with us so we can spread the good together. Where are you watching from, and are you doing well today? If not, leave us a message. Our team is always here to listen. Do you want us to keep telling more heartwarming stories, emotional stories about family, justice, and healing? What words of encouragement would you like to send to the children out there who just need one adult to stand by their side? Thank you for spending your time with us. If this story has made you believe a little more in the power of goodness, leave a comment, share the video with your loved ones, and subscribe so you won't miss the next uplifting story. Every share you make can become a bridge that helps someone vulnerable find a way out. We look forward to seeing you in the next video, where we will continue telling stories that warm the heart and brighten the eyes.